About a decade ago, the hashtag journalism is not a crime became a rallying cry for the media organization I worked with. 3 of my colleagues were jailed for just doing their jobs. But for those instances of journalists silenced by their governments, there are many who quietly try to get the information out to the public despite the risks. Journalists are facing increasing polarization and massive disinformation campaigns on a daily basis. I'm Divya Gopalan, and this is Connected. So we went to RightsCon in Taipei to find out how journalists and the media can remain relevant. The international conference gives a platform for academics, advocates, and industry players to come together and address human rights issues in the digital age. We spoke to Patrick Boehler, the founder of Gazzetta, which supports exiled and underground media, along with Nataliya Gumenyuk, the co-founder of the Public Interest Journalism Lab. Their projects include documenting war witness accounts from the Ukraine-Russia conflict. I'm going to just start with you, Patrick. You worked in government, academia, and media. Why did you set up Gazzetta? What gaps did you find where you felt there was a need for an organization like yours?
I've been a journalist all my life, and including in Hong Kong and this part of the world. And wherever I was a reporter, an editor, or a newsroom manager, I have found our industry to be diminishing relevance. And that's really the challenge that I've been thinking about. So what we are doing is we do a lot of research in terms of what are the information needs so that news organizations can start with reporting that is fundamentally of interest to people, so that there is demand for information that we can then serve and build a relationship with people.
Right. And Nataliya, you're the co-founder of Public Interest Journalism Labs. Can you explain why you set up this organization and what it does?
So I used to work for independent Ukrainian media and before commercial Ukrainian media. And after the Russian invasion in 2014, the whole idea about the fake news was so big. And the fake news mattered, the disinformation mattered. But after years, it kind of became an empty word. And what we started to research also in our station, that the one of the biggest things is like vulnerabilities of the society, polarization, which is happening within society. So it should be a different way to work with media and journalism. Instead of like debunking, find the way how we can talk to the audiences which do not listen, which do not agree. We, as an independent media, can mobilize people who are very much with us, who just want us to be even more kind of clear, radical even in some ideas. And when we're doing kind of more neutral reporting, it's less popular. And then I thought how we can rethink about that maybe we can do the journalism which human rights journalism, journalists about sensitive issues, that the people who kind of disagree with us can trust, first of all, trust. Maybe we won't be popular, but in important moments they will do. That's how we set up this organization, which does research, which produces a conflict. But unfortunately, after the full-scale Russian aggression in 2022, we kind of pivoted to the documentation of the war crimes in a very neutral way, also working with the lawyers, also saying, it's not an opinion, it's the fact, and we can prove it.
So that comes from the point of view of the journalists and people trying to provide that information. But how do you make them work effectively within the space they work in? And with that, where I want to drive the conversation towards information resiliency. What does information first resiliency mean to you within the space that you work in?
I would say there's 2 sides to it. One is the supply side, so that you have factual fact-based information, and that you have a debate around that information that is happening. And then on the demand side, that there is an ability to absorb that information psychologically and be willing to participate in a conversation around that. And I find in our research that we often find a focus on the supply side. So what is it that we need to be doing in terms of messaging, in terms of provision of information, but not enough on the demand side in terms of like where are people coming from that are supposed to be processing that information, and what are they the thing is, even in autocracies, we cannot force anyone to consume information, right? It is really something that is still a personal choice. So how do we create that space in society for factual information?
And what does information resiliency mean for you in the context you work in?
It's a very interesting place, Ukraine, in this regard, because we have 20% of our country occupied by Russia, and there the journalists cannot work. They are detained, arrested, tortured, including the current members of our team who were able to escape. But on the rest of the country, we stayed, because we were able to resist, because we were able to defend itself. Ukrainian journalists are not in exile. They can stay in their communities, work in their communities. That's why, for instance, we were capable to document hundreds of the, war crimes in liberated areas, but at all, being, inside of the country. So for us, it's very practical. It's security opportunity to work at home, but also maintain the level of democracy. Despite of the martial law, we have the functioning parliament. We have issues, obviously. We do investigations about army. I'm speaking more about Ukrainian journalists. We do investigation about corruption during the war, but we are capable to do that. And I think preserving democracy is the most critical thing, that even during the war, we can feel free in our place under the Russian missiles.
You bring up a really interesting point about being able to do your work at home. Patrick, you work with a lot of journalists who cannot do that. Many of them are in exile and trying to disseminate the information from home. Tell me how that works and how you work with them.
The first challenge that you have is really information gathering. So the two challenges are having secure networks of being able to contact people securely without, compromising the safety of people who provide you with information. And the second is data gathering at scale. And it's been really impressive, for instance, in Ukraine, kind of on both fronts, on how the industry has advanced on both sides of that, and has really become a role model for other places where we can learn about how to gather information securely from outside of the country. Bellingcat has been a huge role model in these aspects as well, in terms of open source investigations and verifying footage. And what we're trying to do is really move these skills to areas where there is information demand. So for instance, an example, we work in an autocratic country that is very close to this island, and we see a lot of information demand around the economy, right? Where are job opportunities? What are the biggest concerns related to what happens if you don't get paid? What happens if you need to find another job, what have you? And all those skills can be applied also in those fields. And what's really interesting is that the censors are really focused on dissident media, in the sense of is someone going to be talking about Xi Jinping, right? Is someone going to be talking about another autocratic leader? But they often don't lack the ability and creativity to be monitoring the public debate at large. And that really creates a lot of opportunity for information gathering. And then there's the information distribution comes after that, but often I tell people you got to have really good information that is relevant before you think about distribution.
But I think the relevant is the most important topic. So I it developed in front of my own eyes. When the Crimea has been occupied, the peninsula in the south of Ukraine, it was very sudden. For us, it was just a part of the land where you go for the summer holidays. And I remember how the Ukrainian TV channels were shut down, and there was this information void. But to be honest, they were never, because Russians, when they occupy territory, they shut down all the networks, telecom, something. And first you think that the most important is the access to the Ukrainian media. But after a year, 2, 3, people really don't care much about political fight somewhere in the capital or some other things, because it stopped to be relevant. So it's not the point just to switch it on. The people which are left behind, in the territory which is out of reach of Western media or Ukrainian media, they usually portrayed, as, traitors, or just, kind of in a weird ways, but they just want to be portrayed as a normal people. But also they consume the media, which is entertainment, because the life is so horrible, so you can reach them out through kind of entertainment, of very practical local news. You know, like when the school starts, what happens during COVID, where you go. And of course, national media cannot serve that purpose. So they go, for instance, to the Telegram channel of and they can be weird, they can be not factual, propagandistic. So it's not just about opening and like stopping the restriction and switching on something, because you really need make people watch that and have that it's about them.
So it's about them. So then when you're when journalists in exile are reporting on events that are happening on the ground where people are living, how do people who are where it's happening respond to that? Do they actually trust that this organization is operating from outside the country? Why should I trust their information?
It's really hard. And that is an ongoing conversation in terms of like what are signals of trust, and as this conversation evolves, where I always come back to in my thinking is that you prove utility over time. And I'm just reminded, like you mentioned Crimea, the real estate market in Crimea is really interesting, with people coming in from Russia, buying apartments, and then sometimes leaving again when amid the conflict. And if there is reporting on this that then matches with the lived experience, you build trust, right? So it's a little bit going away from narratives, but really showing people that there is that this is really part of their lives, and you're helping them navigate their lives as they live it. And so I think that's, to me, so far has been kind of the best indicator of like whether a news organization is able to really provide that service sustainably over time from exile.
So I want to come back to your organization, and the makeup of it is very interesting. You've set up an oral history archive of the Ukrainian-Russian war, which involves journalists, sociologists, activists, and even lawyers, I believe. Can you explain that approach?
So within the Reckoning Project, which I co-founded not myself, but with international lawyers, international journalists whom I admire a lot, in the very first day after the full-scale invasion of the Russian war against Ukraine, we thought what we can do beyond the headlines, which would be more credible and would last longer, because very soon the interest of the international media would be over. But also, if there are too much of the war crimes, sorry to say, like after some time people kind of lose the attention to that. So we started to document and record very neutral interviews of the survivors or witnesses of the alleged or potential war crimes. So it's not just the people who were in the area, who something tragic happened to them, but who potentially can testify in the court. So these testimonies are recorded, they are analyzed, there are short summaries written based on them, so that could be easily read by litigators, human rights organizations, because it's very hard to read transcripts. It's impossible to read the database unless you kind of have summaries of them. And the same testimonies, because we are very cautious not traumatize victims and survivors, the very same ones are used for articles, longer pieces in international media, Ukrainian media, globally, not just in Europe and the US, Latin America, Asia, where we can, spread the world. And also we do documentaries based on that, we did a book based on that, and we believe everything we have recorded, something on video, something not, something is from exile, something is anonymous, which can be used for analytical kind of reporting and data. And that also could be preserved as for future memorials, for the memory. So there is a feeling, it's not like we're changing something. We are not stopping the war. We are not preventing somehow, unfortunately, future crimes from happening. And I won't say that it's the most, popular stories, because people are tired to listen about war crimes happened in Ukraine. But I was surprised just recently to say that the last article I wrote on the occupation, based on the lot of testimonies for the Foreign Affairs, was, as they said, like one of the most popular articles on the webpage. It was published just before the Munich Security Conference. It's a heavy article on the occupation. I would never believe it would work. We really think that what we do cannot be that popular. But I think the most important is like you consciously know what are you doing, with which purpose, and then you can pursue.
How do you advise your journalists on what their purpose is? Is it for an international audience, to draw attention to the cause or what's happening in their country or what's happening as far as government repression goes? Or is it to the people who are in that country to understand what is happening around them?
One of the difficult things in this space is that people want to achieve all of the things you just said in one go. And that is often tragic because, like you said, if the intentionality isn't there, it's diluted or it's a matter of luck. And so usually these conversations start with in a journalism funding space where I really talk to funders and say, what are you funding here? Are you supporting a documentation effort, which is really important? Are you supporting a self-expression effort, which is really important? Are you supporting a information service effort, which is really important? Or are you actually supporting a messaging service of some kind of whatever message you want to get across? So by having that intentionality and that clearly spelled out, journalists can make a decision on whether they want to work on these projects or not. And they can also focus in their efforts on what they're doing, right? So focusing on, are we doing the best possible job in documenting the war crimes? Or are we doing the best possible job in informing people in their day-to-day lives? And I'm hopeful that greater intentionality, especially in the next couple of years, because of a significant reduction in international media funding, will lead to some harder choices, but greater intentionality and a greater effectiveness.
On funding, we all now today, also at RightsCon, everybody's speaking about the potential decrease of the funding for media. And as also somebody working on NGO, it's painful to hear, but I remember for the last decade, all the international talks are about how important information became, that it's the most valuable thing in the modern world for security. The leaders of the international organization, the generals, the military, the businessmen, all speaking about the information, media. Why there are no funding? It's just not true. I'm hearing the talks about how important information became. We're living in information age. It's so trendy. I've been to Davos. Everything is about AI. Every single panel is about information. But we're still speaking about the crisis. There are no money in media. And I think that there is something that we really need to reshape. The money should be there because the money exists globally. They just probably should need to be redistributed because it's totally disproportional.
At the same time, many people are not willing to pay for the information because information is everywhere now. You can get it from anything. Why would I pay for information when I can get it absolutely free on my X account or this account, and go through certain firewalls? So, what is it that you advise your journalists as far as putting information out or monetizing it?
The point you just made is the most critical point in all of this, which is that we're not living in an information scarcity environments, and that is in no countries. There were great panels here about Turkmenistan and North Korea. No country on earth has information scarcity. What we lack is scarcity in good information. And so how do we, as journalists who want to provide good, useful information, really stand out? And that brings us back to the conversation around relevance. You have to be able to make a case sustainably over time to people that this is useful in their lives, the journalism that we do. And then build a relationship over time. And that really takes time. And I think a big problem with the funding space right now is that there was this giant conversation about how important it is and a lot of attention on messaging, right? We can fight misinformation and disinformation, and it becomes a marketing conversation, and journalism almost becomes like a marketing enterprise of truth, right? And I think that has been the fatal error of the last couple of years. And I'm really hoping that over the next months, years, because there's a huge urgency in this, we kind of go back to our roots of what journalism is and what it is supposed to do. And then there's funding going into the space that is much more intentional.
Okay, so to pivot from there and talk about what journalism is supposed to do and what journalism is, unfortunately now it's all about getting those clicks and links and those eyeballs and views. Do you have a checklist as to your journalism or your journalists as to what is worth a story, especially is it worth your life, which it comes down to for many? I
think that the wrong idea is to think about how news can compete with entertainment. They can't. They can't. It's a wrong way to create infotainment and think that people would watch news when it would be funky, not a football game. For me, the most important, what is your aim, as you said? It would be very clear. A local organization, hyper-local, who provides the village about what's going on during the war time, or you, the investigation organization. Not everybody can be organization which investigates, but you can be organization which facilitate the dialogue in a polarized society where people stop to talk to each other, which social media don't do. But okay, bring those two influencers and create a talk in which they express different views. So kind of the people from different aisles, political aisles, can talk to each other, but not just for, let's say, fighting each other. That's why you told about the eyeballs. If we measure journalism just with the eyeballs, we are doomed. But I used to run a larger young team. If they don't feel they matter, they don't really understand. People working in the media like to be, quoted, like to be popular. They want their YouTube shows have numbers and numbers. So I think for us as managers, we have to find various ways to explain the cause. I think it's also the task of the media managers, of the editors, help their teams to understand the value of their job, because it's not obvious for a lot of people that your work matter unless somebody kind of points out and deliberately says it matters.
Nataliya, unfortunately, in this day and age, you're quite a rare editor to have, and I think anyone who works with you will be very fortunate. But the reality is, many organizations put people under pressure for those numbers and the KPIs. And so, what is your checklist when you are telling your journalists who already are putting themselves at risk about how much risk they should take?
Just to quickly go back to this point, just because I think the really hardest part is really that what is success right now. And one of the biggest problems that we have is we don't have media leadership globally that is prepared to navigate a world that isn't, in which they cannot have these very high numbers and that illusion of certainty around these numbers. We now have a situation where social media is increasingly fragmented and captured by interests, so that distribution is distorted. And we have a situation where search is being disrupted through generative AI. So the entire model of how we have defined success and influence is collapsing. So how do you go from there? And I thought your points are really fantastic in the sense of what is it that we are doing and how can we serve it and put that first. And we have very few still role models in this space who speak publicly about this.
I always say, I'm coming from the country, it's for a lot of people hard to relate, but everybody understands when I say, do you remember first days of COVID? How we felt we matter in every single country. People wanted to know what the hell exactly you need to do. They didn't want to have a political discussion about COVID. Actually, it was a moment of trust. We lived through that, so maybe that could be a reminder to understand what works and why we are there.
Right. Before we go, I want to talk about Taiwan in particular. Now, Taiwan wants to say it's a young democracy, but a very free space, and wants to pride itself as being the place, especially in Asia, where we're seeing a lot of media spaces shrinking, to be able to still tell the stories and give the information to the world that in a very transparent way. What would you think the lessons, and I'll start with you, Patrick, that Taiwan needs to learn and understand about information resilience as we go forward, given our conversation and, as you were saying, the changing world and ecosystem that we are living in now?
Taiwan is such a precious, rare space where journalism can exist in this region freely, and in this, it stands an opportunity to be part of that next chapter of journalism that is rooted in relevance, rather than perpetuating a model that really didn't work over the last 10, 20 years. That was focused on trying to dominate, competing against disinformation narratives on social platforms. And that is really my hope for Taiwan. Taiwan has its own domestic disinformation problems that are really significant and are being actively exploited. And in that, I'm really hoping that we're not repeating the mistakes that have been made elsewhere. Well, it becomes then us versus then who dominates the narrative, but really focusing the journalism on service. Like you said, the first days of COVID is such a fantastic example. Like, how can we make sure that the journalism that we do is felt and perceived as relevant, as a public good that is appreciated? Because in autocracies, that is not possible, and it's not possible for a reason. But we still have to do, we as journalists have to look in the mirror and have to reflect on how can we deliver on that.
And so to you, Nataliya, same question, but also in the context of Ukraine and how media has managed to operate in Ukraine.
We have various opinions. It's my way, it's my conviction. The other journalists in Ukraine can feel differently, because you need to debunk Russian disinformation. You need to identify, especially if it works together with the military. So, I think we need to think about security and information, because sometimes there is like a different opinion, sometimes there is a disinformation, but then there is a very coordinated campaign to use an information for the military purpose. That could be the difference. But overall, being in a country which is, as I know, the biggest by the territory in Europe, I grew up, as Ukraine is, I always thought I'm from a small country, because we're always in a shadow of Russia. There is big Russia and small Ukraine. And I think it also forced a lot of Ukrainians always to debunk, to think, to challenge, to compete with something we cannot compete. When I used to run a Ukrainian kind of network in English, I counted. With a 1-year budget of the RT, we could exist like 100 million years, just like that. But we can tell our story. So I think it's not about competing. And I really want like a smaller country to say like, we shouldn't compete with the causes. Which cause is more important, Taiwanese or Ukrainian today? Should we just care about Taiwan or Ukraine? Should we care about Gaza or Ukraine, Syria or Ukraine? No, I think we need to share, to tell the stories. This world is more connected than we think. We're speaking here directly. I'm Ukrainian here in Taiwan, and I think we have something to share. So give this platform to people from Hong Kong, people from other places, from Myanmar. So they also feel, they're relevant. So you create your own network instead of relying when, would be an international media organization which has all the services. We know today we are dependent on the leaders in the presidential offices who can, like that, close it down, and we need to maintain our subjectivity and create our own networks. And I believe the networks are so stable, they're most stable. So even like a one big guy can fall if he is alone, but if we are a network of a smaller people connected, we can't be broken that easily.
Well, that was Patrick Boehler, the founder of Gazzetta, and Nataliya Gumenyuk, the co-founder of the Public Interest Journalism Lab. Now, RightsCon was founded in Silicon Valley and provides a space for activists, academics, policymakers, and industrial leaders to explore digital rights. So we asked participants about their concerns regarding the recent funding freeze on U.S. foreign assistance, or USAID.
It's been really devastating, and it's an illegal freeze. So even without a legal basis to do this, having cut off the funds, it means that organizations can't fulfill their commitments.
The freeze of USAID and the rhetoric that has surrounded that is so damaging to civil society across the world, because civil society, for some reason, is all of a sudden frowned upon in a way that hasn't been frowned upon before.
I think this phenomenon really prompted us to reassess how we should be approaching funding in the human rights world, because at the moment, human rights organizations are working to drive changes locally, regionally. It came from our own needs, but we're depending very heavily on external funding, like the USAID, or funding in other places in the global north. We may need to rethink how we mobilize and gather money and funding and resources within our region from our own people for our own good.
It's better if we can have more mutuality as opposed to something that one group is giving to another group under their own conditions.
And we've seen a lot of women be able to build local enterprises through our networks and the work that we're doing to actually sustain their advocacy. And that is the strongest thing. So if you build networks of communities and women's groups that are centered on those relationships and the advocacy and the cause that they're working towards, these collectives can't be broken, regardless of if funding exists or not.
And what do you think? How do you decide where to get your information from? Share your thoughts in the comments section on our YouTube channel. It has been good to have your company. Thank you for watching. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.